University of Southern California, a widely published scholar and popular lecturer. He studies the intersection of race, law, morality, psychology, politics, ordinary language, philosophy, and the performing arts. His latest book, Inward Theory, Race, Language, Unequal Justice, and the Law, looks at America's criminal justice system, among the deadliest and most racist in the world, through deeply intersectional, interdisciplinary lenses. He is a Soros Justice Senior Fellow of the Open Society Institute Center on Crime, Communities, and Culture, and he is on the board of directors of LEAP, Law Enforcement Action Partnership, an international 501c3 nonprofit of police, prosecutors, judges, correctional officials, and other law enforcement officials advocating for criminal justice reform. That is Professor Jody Arman. And last but certainly not least, we have soon to be Dr. Majid Muhammad, who is a doctoral student at the University of California, Santa Barbara, specializing in the study of superconducting photon detectors for quantum and astrophysical applications. However, his journey through higher education began in a prison cell. And before he could graduate high school, he was incarcerated as a juvenile. Remarkably, it was behind bars that he was illuminated by higher education, acting as a catalyst to find prosperity through the wonder of physics. In an effort to dismantle the prison industrial complex, Majid has worked with lawmakers in his home state of Colorado and on a national stage, helping pass legislation which stopped forcing individuals to disclose criminal history, unemployment, and college applications, as well as restoring Pell Grant opportunities for those currently incarcerated. You all see that we have a panel of heavy hitters this evening, and I am the least among these, but certainly honored to moderate this discussion. And I will share with you all, as I shared with our panelists as we were doing our tech check today, that this conversation is a little bit uncomfortable for me. It is definitely outside of my comfort zone because I am a professed abolitionist. So transformative justice, when we're talking about reform, is a bit of a different conversation than I usually have. But I appreciate this conversation so much in that we cannot have a conversation about abolition without crossing this path first. These two conversations don't happen without each other because knowing where we are, we have to start somewhere. And this is where we start because there are no other presidential candidates talking about this issue. There are no other people who are seeking your vote who are talking about what transformative justice could look like in this society. So we are going to dive right on in and talk about what transformative justice can look like in the society in which we currently live. The first question that I have, I'm going to direct to Dr. Bryant specifically. And if any other panelists have anything to add, please feel free. But Dr. Bryant, I'd like to know what ways incarceration can be seen as a source of trauma and grief, and how mass incarceration is connected to a continuation of enslavement and historical trauma.
Thank you so much for the question. I am honored to be here and so grateful that mental health is in the mix, because when we think about incarceration, it is both an extreme stress and for many people can be traumatizing. When we think about a trauma, it is an experience that overwhelms our usual capacity to cope. It is a kind of experience that makes you feel helpless or hopeless. It is a kind of experience where the things that you used to do to manage life don't work in this circumstance. And in the case of incarceration, it is intentionally traumatizing, intentionally dehumanizing. And so when we talk about not having bodily autonomy, when we think about the notion of transformation and growth, when you describe a prison setting, that is not what we would picture in terms of what would help someone turn their lives around. When we think about the high rates of rape that are facing people who are incarcerated, when we think about disconnection from your community, when we think about the ways in which people highlight punishment over transformation, then we understand the ways in which the system is designed and built and maintained in order to break people down and not build people up. And as a result, it not only is intended to break down the individual, but breaking down families and communities, that it is intended to be terrifying. And the experience often requires that in order for people to survive, they have to disconnect from themselves, that you cannot be emotionally wide open and be safe in these settings. And so then it requires emotional suppression, it requires masking, it requires a hardening. And often people who have ended up incarcerated have already experienced early traumas, early difficulties, early violations. And so this then adds to that reality. And when we think of trauma, we're not only considering an individual assault or violation, but the trauma of oppression. That racism is a trauma, classism is a trauma. And then we look at who is largely incarcerated. People of color, and I also want to include our sisters who are incarcerated, and the realities of sexism and the dynamics that many of the women who are incarcerated were with partners where there was abuse and where they were brought into experiences that left them vulnerable, or people trying to make decisions to take care of their families. And so we want to be intentional about this word transformation, healing, and growth. And to do that, we have to stop re-victimizing and re-traumatizing people who have already been made vulnerable.
Absolutely. And you touched on something in that many people who are victims are then criminalized because of the acts that made them victims, whether it's sex trafficking or something of the like. Many times we find that women are incarcerated who are actually victims of crime, but now they have been criminalized. And to talk about race and class, we know that we have a sentencing disparity here in the United States. So, Dr. Armour and Dr. Molina, I'd like for you two to address the policy changes that are needed to address sentencing disparities that are based on race, ethnicity, and class. And feel free to give some background statistics just so that people understand what these disparities really are. And Dr. Molina, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Reverend Jones. We really, really appreciate you. And I want to say that when we first met doing Stop Cop City work in Atlanta, I think that what drew me to you is not just your powerful words and energy, but that we both share a commitment to abolitionism. So I want to be very clear that you are not the only abolitionist in this space, that when we talk about transformative justice, we're talking about the kind of justice that really brings safety to communities of color, to Black communities. I don't have data on this, but my own preliminary investigation is this. No Black person in the world has ever felt safer because police pulled up behind them in traffic, right?
That's right.
Right. What makes us safe is when we have strong community, when we have neighbors. I think, yeah. When we have neighbors we can count on, when we have family, when we have structures, when we know that we live in communities where people have good housing and healthcare, including mental health resources, right? When they have jobs that pay a livable wage, when we have strong labor unions, right? Those are all part of creating safety. And if we look throughout the country, because you asked for some data, I want us to settle on places like Newark, New Jersey, where Mayor Raz Baraka has resourced the community safety teams, right? These are people who are from the neighborhood, who have driven crime down at rates that police simply cannot, because they've earned the trust and respect of the communities that they're serving. They are members of those communities, right? And so when we talk about transformative justice, we're not talking about beginning with police that descend from slave catching and prisons that descend from plantations. We're talking about remembering what justice looks like for Black people to start with and how it extends to everybody else. I want to be clear on policy. You know, some of the most terrible and oppressive policies that we've seen have specifically and deliberately targeted Black people. And so in Los Angeles, where I live, right, we know that, for instance, enhancements have been used to lock people up indefinitely for crimes they're not even accused of. They've made non-crimes crimes. And I don't know if my brother from another mother, Brother Ajamu, who's a co-founder of our Black Lives Matter prison chapter, is on, but I'll just start by telling his story and then I'll be quiet. You know, Brother Ajamu was prosecuted when he was a 16-year-old child. And he was tried as an adult. I want us to think about who we were when we were juniors in high school, right? He was prosecuted as an adult. Brother Ajamu is now 51 years old. He is still in prison because that structure that says you can be prosecuted for the neighborhood that you live in, for who you call your friends and family, right, on something called and be held on things called enhancements, have held this brother who was prosecuted as a child in jail all of this time, in prison all of this time. And so we have to start by dismantling these deliberate structures and these deliberate policies that overwhelmingly incarcerate our folks.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Molina. Professor Armour, if you would, go ahead and jump in. You're still muted.
It's a real honor to be here talking to, in the company of two of the professors of praxis. I've often referred to Melina Abdullah as a professor of praxis, and certainly Cornell West fits that description to a T, right? We're talking about combining theory and practice, making the rubber meet the road, being clear though, getting clarity theoretically, and then driving it home with practice. And as Professor Abdullah pointed out, we have a bloated punishment bureaucracy in this nation. You have to see it as such, that it has real incentives to continue to feed itself money and resources and to increase its bloat even more than it has. And so you have, for example, when you talk about racial disparities, I take some of my students down to San Quentin from time to time. We walked into those cell blocks and you look around you and you see that roughly, 65%, 70% of the faces are Black, right? Shocking, staggering numbers of Black faces in dire, desperate cell block conditions. Then I take my same students, or I myself walk through Skid Row here in LA, which is the highest concentration of houseless folk in the nation. You see the same demographics. 75% of Skid Row is Black folk, right? And there's a direct connection between the economic desperation that makes Skid Row here in LA 75% Black and gives you the same demographics when you go into San Quentin. We've decided that we're not going to spend on social safety of any kind, social safety nets, right? We talk about being tough on crime. The way to be tough on crime, we should all want to be tough on crime by ending criminogenic conditions, ending the conditions that drive people to crime. That's how you're tough on crime, right? And instead of that, we've decided that we are going to hire more police, spend more of our scarce resources on police, even though here in LA and in California, to give you some examples, I was just up at Berkeley Law School arguing in a debate with people from the Manhattan Institute and the Heritage Foundation, two conservative think tanks, right? And they were arguing about, well, do we really need any kind of criminal justice reform? What I was pointing out to them is, when you look at the data, we are now at a 50-year low in the homicide rate. We're at a 50-year low in the homicide rate. And property crimes haven't been this low since 1961. Yet we're spending more and more on police. When you look at the graphs, you have places like LA, major metropolitan areas all over the country are strapped for money. They're having hiring freezes. They're not supporting any kind of schooling and education program because they're feeding the police. Even though the police clearance rates, you look at the clearance rates since 1990, they've gone down like this. They've gone in a steady direction down while the spending has gone up like this. There are fewer crimes to solve, but their clearance rate is going down while the spending on them is going up, right? So we're clearly not getting any kind of decent return on our investment. Crime going down, spending going up, and clearance rates plummeting. And it's because we are really, when it comes to kind of criminal justice matters, we don't think about it in the way that Dr. Molina was pointing out. The safest neighborhoods in LA are the neighborhoods with the best resources. When I go to Bel Air, I don't have any crime issues that they're talking about there, or lots of parts of the Palisades, or, you go up and down neighborhoods that are well-resourced, the crime is low. Those neighborhoods without the resources, the crime is up. And that's because we're squandering so many of our scarce resources on the punishment, the bloated punishment bureaucracy.
All right. I mean, what more do we really need to hear after that? But what I am hearing definitively is that we continue to spend money on policing and less on community resources, because the same money that's going into policing is not going into mental health resources. Here in Atlanta, Georgia, where I live, there is no mental health infrastructure. There is no way to get help for someone experiencing a mental health crisis without calling 911. And the police always have to be dispatched. And that adds on to the trauma that people are already experiencing when they are in the midst of crisis. So we're not talking about community resources that are going to make sure that the material conditions of residents improve. We're talking about just giving it to police, the way they've done here in Atlanta, passed the largest budget in history with 1/3 going to policing. And the best they can do for affordable housing is shipping containers. But I'll get off of that soapbox and move on to include our other panelist, soon to be Dr. Majid Muhammad. And Majid, I'd love to hear just a bit about your own personal journey, being incarcerated as a juvenile, what that looked like, and how these sentencing disparities affected you personally, and how you went on to be able to advocate for blocking the box on employment and college applications.
Oh, thank you, Reverend Jones, and to Professor West and Professor Abdullah. I appreciate the invitation and being here. I mean, similar to Ajamu, I was 17 years old when I was incarcerated in California for a couple nonviolent robbery offenses. This is, senior year of high school, made plenty of mistakes. But I always think to myself and wonder, was my 8-year adult prison sentence the best of outcomes? Was that going to be the most rehabilitative? Was that going to be the place that gave me the best chance for reinventing my life and building success? So I don't like to play a victim card because I know I victimize people, and it's important that I express that. However, in tandem with that, I do feel like I'm in a country that is born and raised in this country that has over militarized and policed the environments that I was born and raised in, and given my environment and my upbringing, I think it led me or enhanced the probability that I made the decisions that I made and went down into the direction that I inevitably went. However, crawling out of that was difficult, and I could explain what saved me, as noted in my in the bio, was my access to education while incarcerated. So being in prison was harmful enough, And without that access to higher education, like community college courses, as well as some bachelor programs, I would not have been able to get a head start on really critically thinking and changing the direction that I was headed down at such a young age. And so in California, where I was incarcerated, I had access to that education. And then when I was transferred to Colorado, where I also had to serve a bit of time for similar crimes, there was no college education programs. And I remember starkly seeing a contrast between the livelihood and the thought process and the violence, most notably within the California institution that I was held, as opposed to the Colorado one. There were programs like getting people into a college dorm, so you lived amongst other people who were in school. And so these programs and these resources really kept people like myself focused on their goals and and what trajectory they were trying to set for themselves. Whereas in Colorado, it was much more, education was not a priority. The institution did not view it as a priority. And so that, manifested itself in negative ways in the environment, in that prison environment. And as far as the criminal justice reform, when I got out, I told myself while I was on the inside that I wanted the PhD, and that was something that I truly desired, but did not know that a person with a felony conviction could actually attain a degree in STEM, let alone work beyond that degree. And so I started coming in contact with resources on the outside, one of which was from Prison Cells a PhD, which is a transition program for those who are formerly incarcerated, who are interested in joining higher education programs, based out of Baltimore, ran by Dr. Stanley Andrees, who's an endocrinologist scientist. And I saw that, he's created such a wonderful life for himself and was able to obtain so much within STEM that it really gave me a sense of direction and purpose, as well as really enlighten me that these barriers that are set out there in society can be broken by us, but it takes a community, it takes us building support for each other. And that's what he did. He built support for me. And so from there, I felt the necessity to also try to build that for the people who come after me. So as a student at UCSB, I am trying to hold seminar courses for those who are formerly incarcerated as a representative of underground scholars. In fact, actually, we're holding one of the first college courses for formerly incarcerated students at UCSB. And last semester, we had a mix of people who were incarcerated and people who weren't. And it was as enlightening for those who have never been impacted by a criminal justice system to sit in a room with those who were and hear those stories and really participate in a conversation that I feel like will help move our communities and move the needle forward towards a more just society. And so I do believe it's our community efforts that, and it's the ability for us to, and me myself, to get into a position where, if I'm a professor one day, am I going to be the one who's going inside those prisons and trying to give back? Can we, increase resources and funding to those institutions for those resources that are very necessary to combat, I guess, the militarization and police heavy forces that we see in our society today.
Thanks so much. Soon to be Dr. Muhammad. Now we are kind of winding down, but we are going to continue with this conversation from this point on. I am going to give specific time limits because I really want us to get through a couple of these other questions. So for the next question, I would like Dr. Abdullah and Professor Armour to answer 2 minutes each. How do we address the economic incentives that drive mass incarceration? Because we do understand that all of this whole conversation is happening because of racialized capitalism that is undergirded by white supremacy. So from the both of you, in 2 minutes apiece, tell us how we can address the economic incentives that drive mass incarceration. And we'll start with Professor Armour.
Yeah, the economic incentives that drive mass incarceration are many and varied. One of the places they begin is police unions. Police unions have outsized influence and power over the budgeting process, over the political process. They make campaign contributions, huge campaign contributions. After Citizens United, they're able to flex in almost an unlimited way, and they're able to keep politicians on their tether, at the end of a rope. And politicians have to refuse to take police union money. We have to get commitments from politicians that they will not take police union money as one way of starting to drive that money out of politics, because it's huge. It's not just police, it's corrections officers, right? The prison problem isn't just a private prison problem. The public prisons can be just as bad with their corrections and correctional officers, lobbies, and the like. And so that's one big economic incentive. I know I'm down to probably 30 seconds, and I want to hear Professor Abdullah. So after we take on some of them, we have to also make sure that, as Professor Abdullah has pointed out, make sure that city council recognizes that at the state level, everywhere, they recognize that a budget is a statement of values. It's where you state your priorities and values most clearly. And when you have, like in LA, 50% of unrestricted funds going to the police, you're stating that your values are not on prevention, but on incarceration and on cracking down on the down and out. And speaking of cracking down on the down and out, we're getting ready to see a case go to the Supreme Court in which they're probably going to say it's all right to criminalize people who are houseless. And I just talked about going through Skid Row. 75% of the folks in our Skid Row here in LA, largest concentration of houseless folk in America, are Black folk, right? They're getting ready to say just existing without a home and in a situation in which the city cannot provide you with an alternative is still a criminal offense that will lock you up for. Right? Not providing housing, not providing support, but instead finding ways to spend more on police and incarceration. So those are two of the ways.
Yeah, absolutely. You did wonderful. Only a few seconds over. And I hear you on all of that. Dr. Melina Abdullah.
And I feel everything that Brother Jody Armour is sharing. And I'll just add with Skid Row also sits in the shadow of multi-billion-dollar high-rises that are vacant because they weren't a beneficial capitalist investment, right? So when we look at what's happening and when we look at this question about economic incentives, we got to really think about budgets are moral and ethical documents, and they are zero-sum games, right? So what's happened is policymakers have chosen to create policies that benefit the capitalist class, that benefit the ownership class, that benefit police associations, which the only thing I would ever disagree with Professor Armour on is they are not unions, right? Labor unions, real labor unions, stand on the side of working class people, right? I'm a member of a real labor union. Police associations are organized crime that solely exists to benefit policing and the entities that they protect, right? So what they've decided is to siphon resources away from the working class, away from Black folks, away from brown folks, and enrich and even increasing numbers, a capitalist class that just becomes richer and richer and richer. And so we have to recognize that, one, we have to undo police associations. Black Lives Matter Grassroots has been waging a campaign to oust police associations from every house of labor that we can. We want to recognize that police associations are not just our opponents, they are our enemies, and we have to oust them. We also have to remember that it is the capitalist class that is making themselves rich on the backs of working class and poor people that ultimately benefits from the mass incarceration of our folks.
Absolutely wonderful. And let's not forget the police foundations that are allowed to be nonprofit corporations, although they are comprised of the heads of Fortune 500 companies, that they do not exist to serve actual law enforcement personnel, and that what they do is make it so that policing now becomes a private entity for corporations through police foundations. And when we talk about our budgets being moral documents, I need the people to remember that. So stop voting for these people who continue to throw your money at policing instead of putting resources into your communities. When you talk about what it is that we need to do and how we mobilize and how we make this conversation a reality, we got to put some onus on the people, because when we vote for people who don't represent us, we need to hold them accountable, and we need to make sure that we send a very clear message that you ain't getting nobody's vote if you keep putting cops in my community, but you're taking hospitals out. Now, I want to move on to Dr. Bryant, because when we talk about a lot of the resources that we don't have in community, and we talk about the trauma of mass incarceration, there is a real cost to the trauma of mass incarceration. And Dr. Bryant, I'd like for you to expound upon the actual cost to the community that mass incarceration poses.
Thank you so much. And I want to start by really appreciating the point, one of the many great points that you made, Brother Majid, in terms of the acknowledgement that people were harmed. And I think that is so important, because as we talk about the trauma of incarceration, we also know about the trauma of victims. And a large part of my work has been not only with people who have offended, but also victims and trauma survivors. And I think this is an important point to make when we talk about our community, because sometimes when people hear the languaging of transformative justice, they're thinking that we don't care about the people who have been harmed. But I think what's critical is, yes, I've harmed, and I was able to transform my life with support so that I don't engage in those behaviors anymore. And when that intervention and support doesn't take place, then we're actually increasing and including the recidivism and the additional harming. So I want us to hold that when we're talking about the community, and the devastating impact is distrust, disconnection. And when you have, even our Surgeon General declared an epidemic of loneliness, that people for the first time largely in our communities have talked about feeling like they don't have support, or don't have a sense of belonging, or don't feel like there's anyone advocating for them. And so it is not only the trauma of the person who is living in a dehumanized prison system, but we're also talking about their children, their loved ones, their parents, who say, like, we're doing time too. And the losses, people have talked about it as a traumatic grief of lost time and lost connection. And then you multiply that on a grand scale. And one of the painful things is hopelessness. When the system is so large, which is why people plead out for things they didn't do, because they feel like it's, I don't have a voice, I don't have agency, I just have to accept things that are not fair. And so in order to shift the tide, to bring healing, safety, hope, then we have to get out of the punitive system and into the transformation system.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Bryant. And for soon to be Dr. Majid Muhammad, my question for you is, what does successful reentry look like And then after that, we'll close out with our last question for Dr. West.
Well, I would say it definitely starts with housing. You can't talk about education and your future and what you want to accomplish in life unless you have a roof over your head and some food and on the table. That's why transitional housing is really important for when we talk about allocating money from these police institutions, and it should go to these communities that are and to the people within these communities that are struggling the most. And then for me, higher education was my savior, in addition to God, of course. But I don't necessarily think that everyone needs to get a college degree if you don't want one, right? There's plenty of trades, skills, and building up a resume and learning and education is not necessarily done in those ivory towers. But quality education can be obtained there. So really a discovery of oneself and their ambitions and what they want to do. And then widespread access to those opportunities. I don't think I would have gotten accepted into my graduate program had I not had the internship opportunities that I did in undergrad. And a lot of those were developed by those who either were formerly incarcerated or aligned with transformative justice movements, in order to offer people like me, or where I come from, an opportunity to gain those skill sets. I'm in STEM. I'm an experimentalist, and so how does there weren't no experiments in physics going on inside that prison cell. It was only after I got out that I was able to obtain those opportunities. So again, for me, it seems like a matter of allocation of resources to inspire the next generation to obtain whatever it is that they desire the most.
Absolutely. And thank you for that. Our last question before we turn it back over to Stanley with the Q&A goes to you, Dr. West. Tell me what the societal benefits are to restoring voting rights for those who have been incarcerated, because we know we have a lot of people who sit behind bars who are counted every year or every 10 years in census, but they don't get to vote. They don't have representation, yet we use them to draw voting maps and count them for the census. But what does it look like to restore voting rights for people who have been incarcerated? And what are the benefits to our society in that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I just first want to say this has been such a high quality, critical dialogue, and I appreciated it. My mind has been unsettled and my soul has been fed. And I also want to say, even before I get into talking about voting, is that you all know what happened in Mississippi today with Brother Malik Shabazz sending policemen to jail as a result of some accountability of Brother Jenkins and Brother Parker, that this campaign began by going down to pay tribute to Fannie Lou Hamer in Jackson and Lexington and Brandon, and visiting the families of Brother Jenkins and Brother Parker. So when I found out today that it culminated with that particular verdict, I think that's worth mentioning in terms of our fight back, because the analysis that we put forward has to be sharp and subtle, but we must always accent our resilience and our resistance, our fight back. That's always something that has to have the last word. And I think it goes hand in hand with what happened today with our dear sister, Lynn Abdullah, and just the historic quality of her being part and parcel of this movement and this campaign as a moment in the movement that has a long history. Now, for voting rights, for me, it's a matter of always starting with the humanity, the rich humanity and creativity of those who are incarcerated. And that means lifting their voices. I've been blessed to teach in prisons for 41 years, going back to 1979 in Norfolk, which is Malcolm's prison. I've just recently taught at Broadway, and I've been blessed to teach in between, and being able to have a number of students. Brother Anthony Edwards, who got a PhD under me, that wrote a 400-page dissertation on being and Blackness, who became a professor at Pace University. He passed recently. but he's one of my major students who was there in Greensfield, prison right outside of Poughkeepsie, where Vassar College was when I was teaching at Union in my 20s and 30s. And so for me, when you talk about humanity, creativity, voice, you see, vote is just one particular expression of the voice. And the anthem of Black folk is lift every voice, which is a way of affirming Black humanity, affirming Black creativity, affirming Black resiliency. And so, yes, voting is part and parcel of it. But from the discussion that we have had here, we also see predatory capitalist processes that connect privatizing to militarizing, that think that every problem is responded to by means of some militaristic solution. It could be Gaza on the one hand, it could be Stop Cop City on the other, it could be schools where you have more policemen than you have nurses and counselors. That's part of the militarization that goes hand in hand with the commodification. So that the privatizing and the militarizing go hand in hand, and the military takes care of the well-to-do, or the police try to protect and serve for the well-to-do, and they repress and contain for those who have much less. So when you live in a society in which Black lives have less value than white lives, poor people's lives have less value than rich people's lives, and so forth and so on, then we have a framework in which we say, hey, let's affirm the humanity of folk that includes lifting their voices so they're not just echoes to be manipulated, but voices to be forces in history and forces in their lives, and then be able to gain the right to vote as they have in certain states. I know in Florida, of all states, was one of the first to push through, but then they had pushed back against that. But then they're able to become part and parcel of what we're trying to do in this campaign, which is always to start with the humanity and creativity of those Sly Stone called everyday people, those James Cleveland called ordinary people, and those Francis Fanon called the wretched of the earth. And we're talking very much about ourselves or our mamas, our grandmothers, and others who have been terrorized, traumatized, hated, and exploited. Wretched of the earth, but the wretchedness never having the last word. The fight back, always center stage. And to have our dear sister, Dr. Brian, and Dito, and Brother Jody, and Brother Mohammed, and of course today is a holy day with our precious Muslim brothers and sisters. You all have been worked and overworked on this holy day. I tell you, we Christians, when we say holy day, we tend to just steal away, you know. we don't work this hard, but it's a beautiful thing, and we all in it together. We're religious, non-religious, secular, Buddhists like bell hooks or whatever, and be able to end it in this day. And my dear sister, Reverend Jones, spending that time with you in Atlanta was such a joy. You have been masterful. You've been like Mary Lou Williams playing her orchestra, guiding her orchestra, conducting her orchestra, moving so smoothly to tease out the best of our voices as we focus on these deep issues of social misery and suffering, and always highlight the resistance.
Thank you so much, Dr. West, for that final answer. Thank you to all of our panelists, this esteemed panel. I appreciate you so much. I appreciate being considered to moderate this panel. This discussion has been robust, but I know we do have a few questions. I'm going to turn it over now to Stanley, who will continue with our question and answer period.
Thank you, Reverend Jones. This has been a remarkable and insightful and incredible conversation and dialogue. We are able to focus on two questions. We tried to look at some questions that have also engaged a lot of your questions from the audience. The first question is, with increased inflation, I'm running into families on multiple scales, more and more being driven into homelessness. When I contact Senate offices here and share my concerns, phone calls are often ignored. What is the next best step to get their attention, since the situation is already critical for many? And we'll open that up to our panel. I'll also put it back in the chat so that you can see the question. Again, with increased inflation, I'm running into families on multiple scales, more and more being driven into homelessness. When I contact Senate offices here and share my concerns, phone calls are often ignored. What is the next best step to get their attention since the situation is already critical for many?
I guess I can just start not speaking specifically because I don't know your locale and I don't know what the landscape is, but I can say for solutions, we need to have community organizing that works, right? We need to build strong community organizations. I'm thinking about the work that's being done in Los Angeles around Skid Row. I'm thinking about work by organizations like Los Angeles Community Action Network, people like Pastor Q, who are organizing unhoused people to say we need house keys, not handcuffs. And more as unhoused folks become criminalized for what's really, and I know Brother Majid can co-sign, you know, when we talk about what's criminal, before we condemn the people that society calls criminal, we have to think about the role of society in creating those conditions. So what's actually criminal is building a society where everyone is not housed. Unhoused people are not behaving criminally. They're behaving as people who are deprived of resources that should be ours by right of being human beings and by right of being children of the Most High. And so it's really, really important that we not only ask for, but demand what our people deserve. And so I'm thinking also about some radical actions that have begun to take place, right? So everybody who watches social media knows of the huge high rise that was built and now sits empty as an eyesore in Los Angeles, right? So I think the takeover of buildings like that might be something that communities want to talk about. The idea that there's corporate-owned housing where nobody lives, they're just falsely driving up housing prices. Those are criminal acts, and we as people of community who belong to each other have to demand and take for ourselves more by organizing together.
Absolutely.
And I would just add, along with the community organizing, going more local. If people aren't responding on the Senate level, your city council and your mayor, people who are closer to where the community is that you're talking about, because one, the access is easier, and also around accountability and monitoring.
And we here in LA put to the test one solution that politicians often recommend as a policy matter, and that is addressing homelessness by cracking down on the down and out, bringing in police, using citations and handcuffs, putting them in jail cells, because as they see it, the problem of houselessness is not the lack of affordable housing, the lack of adequate jobs and crumbling schools. They see it as a matter of personal responsibility. People lack personal responsibility. And so what they're going to do in cracking down on the down and out is send them to shelters that are going to put them on a 12-step program that they have to adhere to very, strictly, or else they get booted out of that 12-step program and land back on the sidewalk. And they tried that here in LA. That was called the Safer Cities Initiative. They poured hundreds of millions of dollars into it, made Skid Row the most heavily policed real estate in the country. And between 2006 and 2012, the houselessness problem just blew up. It did not go down, it went up. And now it's worse than ever, showing that those kinds of interventions that rely in any way on the bloated punishment bureaucracy are ineffective and in fact counterproductive. And we need to keep that real clear in our focus when we're thinking about policies and the houseless.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. We'll go to our next question, and I'll put it in the chat before I read it so we have some time to respond. I appreciate the notion of tackling the root causes that create the prison industrial complex and the acknowledgement of the relationship between trauma and matters of justice. What about the folks who have been impacted by trauma in a way that has, in effect, caused them to bleed on others in their suffering? Is the abolition of police and the prison industrial complex absolute? Is there an alternative to the current prison system that is intended to be implemented? Wonderful question.
Thank you so much for this question. And it is critical because those who have been impacted by violence deserve our care and attention as well, and deserve safety. And so what we need to understand about the current system is there is a real lack of resources for mental health. When we talk about, the wait time to be able to see a psychologist, to be able to see a therapist, and the resources that they have, they are often largely understaffed. And so then you're just housing people, but not really able to do the healing and transformation. So what is really needed for the transformation are mental health services around addiction, around trauma, around conflict resolution, around parenting, so that we can actually get changes in behavior, because the punitive alone or with peripheral marginal services does not bring about life change. And so I am thinking about trauma survivors when I'm advocating for transformation, because if not, you let time pass. And now people come out and not only are the same, but sometimes even engaging in worse behaviors. And so not having the support systems in place. I do want to also name restorative justice, which is more victim-centered and getting from the victims what would be helpful to them. Some of the work from psychiatrist Judith Herman, who's a trauma expert, she did extensive interviews with trauma survivors about what would be justice to you. And many of them said the primary piece is wanting a public acknowledgement from persons in authority that what was done to them was wrong. It wasn't so much I want revenge or I want them to suffer, that I needed to be called out, that I was not at fault for what happened to me. And the times in which those victims wanted incarceration, it was when they believed the person was still a threat to them or that the person was going to keep harming other people. So we want to consider, again, the mental health piece, the victim's perspective about what would be helpful, because the punitive piece alone also doesn't really bring peace or resolution to those who have been harmed.
Yeah, I need to agree with Dr. Bryant. The battle cry of many supporters of the carceral state is victims' rights. They come into every discussion, every debate. Well, what about the victims' rights? Not recognizing that there's often no real hard distinction between victims and victimizers. A lot of so-called victimizers were themselves victims. When we go into San Quentin, we sit down and we talk to many of the lifers without parole, et cetera. It's shocking what number of them have gone through extreme trauma, come through the foster care system, brutal kinds of discipline systems with cigarettes being put out on them and thrown into car trunks and the like. And what you realize is that hurt people hurt people. That's reality. That distinction between victims and victimizers is not nearly as sharp as people think it is. And we need to move toward a new moral compass when it comes to matters of blame and punishment, away from retribution, retaliation, and revenge, and towards redemption, restoration, and rehabilitation, right? That needs to be a radical 180-degree shift in our moral compass when it comes to criminal justice matters, and recognizing that hurt people hurt people.
These are great answers. I just want to give space to if anyone else would like to address that final question.
I just want to lift up some incredible work that is moving, because it's really important that, and I believe that this is what our campaign is about, right? That we committed to being Harriet Tubman abolitionists, right? So we believe in toppling systems of harm like prisons and police, but also building systems of care, building systems of love. Our platform is truth, love, and justice. And so as we think about that, it's really important to understand that there are seeds that are already being sown. There are models that are already being implemented. So I mentioned Newark, New Jersey, and community safety teams. That is the brainchild of one of my best friends on the planet, Akila Sherrills, who comes out of Watts, right? Who is, as Professor Armour said, has been on both sides of the thing, right? Where his own son was killed. And as the father of a murder victim, recognized that it's a systemic transformation that has to take place in order to save the lives of children like his, right? I want to lift up the incredible work of Kat Brooks up in Oakland with Anti-Police Terror Project, who's building out alternatives to police. I want to lift up the work that the Movement for Black Lives is doing all around the country to resource those of us who are building alternatives to police. And then I also want us to be very clear about what's at stake. This next weekend, not the one coming up, but on April 20th, we'll be burying Ryan Gaynor, who was a 15-year-old Black autistic child who his parents called 911 for help as he was suffering through a mental health crisis. They never would have called 911 if they knew those San Bernardino sheriff's deputies would come and murder this 15-year-old brilliant Black boy in his front yard. And so we absolutely must know that the kind of transformation, the kind of transformative justice that we're envisioning here is possible if we choose and invest in it. And if we don't invest in it, that there will be many, many more Ryan Gaynors and Niani Finlaysons, the Black mother who called 911 and she was experiencing a domestic dispute, and LA County sheriffs shot her dead in front of her 9-year-old child, right? And so we have to vision and also build what it is we're talking about here.
I want to echo the celebration of those who are doing the good work, and many in the faith communities. I want to appreciate Abolition Sanctuary, Dr. Nakia Robert, and training churches to address mass incarceration, and especially supporting incarcerated, impoverished mothers and the decisions that they make in their parenting in terms of trying to provide. So looking at our moral compass. I want to appreciate my home church, First AME Church in Los Angeles, that holds a free legal clinic to help people get the support they need in order to get justice. I want to appreciate the work at Reverend Raphael Warnock's church in Atlanta. They have an initiative to stop mass incarceration, holding clinics for record expungement, and also to raise money for bail. And we know bail is a whole issue we could have a whole night talking about. And so grateful for liberation mental health providers who are attuned not only to the internal world, but these external systems and how we navigate them. So it's a huge, massive trauma and issue. And there are people who have their hands to the plow, communities that are doing the work from different disciplines. And so I'm grateful for that.
Thank you so much. Again, this has been a great conversation and dialogue about transformative justice. As we near the end of our time together, we would like to offer our panelists maybe one last sentence, one thing that you want everyone to leave with, our audience to leave with Afterwards, we'll have closing remarks by Dr. Cornell West.
I'd like to go first. It was an honor to be here. I'd like to say that it was not always that I thought that I was a steward of this planet and a person who was directly responsible for the outcomes of my community. And I want people to know that those who are formerly incarcerated still have a place in our community, and in fact, a large role in trying to mitigate the cycle of trauma that goes from generation to generation. And if you do not allow people like myself to give back to our communities, then we're doing a disservice to us all.
Yeah, well, I'll just weigh in with one piece of, I hope, kind of advice that we can try to put into practice, and that is beware of moral panics. We see a lot of moral panics around, for example, the theft hoax. You remember the theft hoax, you know, the smash and grab stuff that was on the television constantly, and you had various societies coming out, associations for the retail groups coming out saying that the shrinkage that they were suffering, which was billions, you know, nearly $100 billion a year, that 50% of it was due to these kinds of smash and grab theft rings. It turned out, they said that 50% was a lie. It was 5%. That's what the numbers showed. It was less than 5% of the shrinkage could be attributed to any of those kinds of retail theft rings. But the hoax itself led people into a moral panic. You have the governor of California saying we need 300 million more for police to go out there and get at these thefts. We need to roll back Proposition 47. It was all a lie. The fentanyl hoax is another lie. Nobody dies from touching fentanyl. You know, the mayor of LA said you can die from touching fentanyl. That is no scientific basis to that at all. That's like a flat eartherism. What we need to do is go into these discussions and debates and with receipts, with data, being evidence-based. Right now, violent crime is at a 50-year low. Property crime is at a 60-year low. And yet they're trying to have us spend more money on police, more money on the bloated punishment bureaucracy. Crime is going down. The police clearance rates are going down, but they're having to spend more money and taking it away from real programs that can help the down and out, right? And help lift people out of criminogenic conditions. So being evidence-based and avoiding moral panics.
Thank you so much for that.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to uplift liberation psychology, which instead of focusing on what we want to remove, we focus on what we want to create. And so for us to imagine what freedom and wholeness look like for ourselves, for our family, for our communities, and then get in the stream to building that, to not just being reactive, but reimagining our possibilities.
I'll just offer that let's wake up each day remembering that we have power. We have power. So let's commit to one thing a day. I know sometimes when we talk about toppling a prison system or toppling a policing system, it seems so daunting. It seems insurmountable. But let's do one thing a day. And so I dropped in the chat, one of the things we want to do is free Black freedom fighter and mama of 6, Brittany Martin. You can just sign and share that petition today. tinyurl.com/free Brittany Martin. tinyurl.com/free Brittany Martin. Every Wednesday, we're in the streets protesting police associations. Join us in that fight. And then look into organizations that are doing the work that we want to have done. So as Dr. Thema was saying, we have to imagine and we have to build towards it. So Anti-Police Terror Project, Movement for Black Lives, community safety teams, all of that, and push our cities, our local governments to divest from policing and invest in the resources that actually keep communities safe.
Thank you, Dr. Abdullah. Before we transition to Dr. West, we would just like to bring visibility to one of our co-campaign managers. That's Kiana Dent, and she's going to put some links in the chat. There are 4 ways that you can continue this conversation and continue to be in community with us. That is by volunteering, donating, rocking the merch, and also signing up for updates. Also, all of your questions that were not answered, we have recorded them to help us to think through and with you as community. So if your question was not answered, we have a collection of your questions that will be engaging with you as well. At this time, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Cornel West.
Well, there's not too much left to say. This has been extraordinary. I leave more fortified, and that's always the bottom line. That's always the bottom line. Now, I think about my dear sister, Melina, being out there 164 weeks, every Wednesday in a row. See, that's the quality of commitment. That's the longevity of courage. That's because you love the people. You have a care. You have a deep concern. That is the bottom line of folk across the board on this screen and all of the freedom fighters in the past and present. And it's just important for us to always remember that we should never, ever be surprised by evil. We should never, ever be paralyzed by despair. Evil is on its way. David is already ready with the right rock and the right, I should say Goliath is ready, but with David, with the right rock and the right slingshot, which is to say, putting on the full armor, the weaponry, intellectual, spiritual, moral, political, organizational, across the board. That's the only reason why we still here in our right minds. That's what the folk before were able to do. And they passed it on to us. They poured it into us. All that love, all that integrity, all that blood, sweat, and tears, all that determination, all that laughter, all that style. Yes, here we are, still swinging. And we're going to go down swinging, just like Ella Fitzgerald and Muhammad Ali and Hank Aaron. Just keep swinging in our own distinctive ways. Ooh, what a people, what a tradition, what a struggle. Ooh, it's a human thing all the way down.
I would like to thank everyone for coming. Thank you, Dr. West. This has been another incredible segment for our Policy Pillar Hour on Transformative Justice. Let's give a round of applause for all of our participants. I want to thank all of you, all of our audience, wherever you are. Thank you for being here this evening and tonight.
And we thank you, Brother Stanley. We thank you too. And Sister Kiana Jones.
Thank you.
Kiana Dent. It was wonderful. Wonderful. That's it. You all stay strong now. Oh, you got a little cold train now. God almighty. Ooh, you got to listen to train to get to that. Alabama, Alabama, Alabama.
Have a good evening, all.
Love y'all. Love you, love you. Lord, 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 Lord. Mm, mm. Lord, 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 Lord. Love y'all. Love you, love you.
Love you
Thanks
too.
so much, everybody. Have a good night. Love y'all.
Good night, everyone. Thank you all.